Earthquake, it's interesting with insurance. So let's take a bigger view first. You go on the East Coast, where they suffer from hurricanes and windstorms, and you pay dearly for windstorm coverage, but earthquake is free. Come out to the West Coast, where we suffer earthquakes, you pay dearly for earthquake, but yet windstorm coverage is free. And we do have windstorms, we do have tornadoes, we don't have hurricanes, but we get the after effect of them. Earthquake was something that everyone was aware of, the insurance industry especially. Insurance industry does not like to insure things that they have to pay claims with. As you could see, every time there's a major disaster and they pay claims, all of a sudden they start writing that coverage out. We're dealing with that with COVID at the moment. It was approximately mid-1980s, 83, 84, when insurance became mandated, at least the offer of insurance. And to this day, you get when you renew insurance in California, you get an offer of coverage. You have to sign it to reject it. If you don't accept it right then and there, most likely you will not get your coverage for another year. Deductibles are high, and they keep getting higher and higher every time we have a major earthquake. So insurance is available, but it is expensive. And what people don't understand is the deductible concept of insurance. People buy insurance. They look after an earthquake. We saw it in Sylmar, Whittier Narrows. We see it in the Northridge earthquake, Loma, Prieta, all of them. Your houses have a lot of cracking damage in it. Window frames will crack. Your paint will crack. It might peel off. Sidewalks will crack, flatscapes and things like that. Most of the time, none of that will make your deductible. You need serious, serious damage in order for an earthquake policy to step in. So when I'm asked about this all the time, I say, should I buy earthquake is the question. And the answer is, if you expect major damage to your house, yes, you should. But if you're looking to buy insurance to pick up the painting and the cracks around the doors, don't buy your insurance for that. Now that it's been quite a while since our last major earthquake, the Northridge earthquake, deductibles are coming down. The insurance is getting a little cheaper until the next earth movement, and then it'll be difficult and impossible to get again. Try buying fire insurance if you live up in the brush area or the hills today, after all the fires we've had.
When it comes to before Sylmar, the last huge earthquake in this country, or in California, was the 33 Long Beach quake.
Well, the Whittier Narrows was pretty bad too.
Yeah, but that was after Sylmar.
Was that after Sylmar?
Yeah.
Okay.
Whittier Narrows was...
All right, so 33 the Long Beach.
33 to 71. Next big one, as far as huge one, was 94. So it's like every 20 some odd years, it seems like. When people came out of, let's say, Long Beach and also Sylmar, was there a big push to say, why don't we have earthquake insurance? Why isn't it, do we need it? Well, I mean, we've got all this destruction. Why shouldn't there be that insurance?
Well, obviously, I can't speak to 1933. My father was a young man in those days. But every time there's a major disaster, there is the talk about buying more and more insurance from the consumer end, especially people that don't have insurance. Legislatures jump up and down. They're going to mandate it. Rarely does anything happen. The insurance industry is jumping up and down and rallying against having to cover these things. Insurance companies are smart. They look at the risk. If they think they have to pay, they don't want the risk. And it took a legislative mandate in the mid-'80s in order to make insurance companies offer earthquake. It's going to take the same type of initiative to get the homeowners coverage back in the fire areas here. In now that we're in 2020, that's going to be an issue. So as I like to say, whenever the insurance company shall giveth, they shall taketh away. And when they had to pay out on some of the claims, and there wasn't a whole lot of insurance, not like there was in Northridge, and even there it was limited, the insurance companies are going to back away from trying to offer that.
One of the things that come up, and I know you can't speak to Sylmar on this, but you did tell me that you had a situation up in the Bay Area It's in Silmar, we had a situation, and I'm sure we've had it everywhere else, and it may have been more widespread than we know, but due to the fact that commercial properties, large grocery stores, things like that, didn't have earthquake insurance, but they had a lot of destruction. Lo and behold, a couple weeks later, 3 weeks later, there was a series of several of these stores that had fires. One we know was suspicious. One at the time was listed as electrical. We're not sure about that. Nobody was ever prosecuted for either one of those. So it doesn't mean that they weren't arson. It just means that nobody got caught. Do we see this happening? I don't want to say more often, but how much of a problem is it?
I've honestly never noticed that. The closest that it affected me was the Loma Prieta earthquake. We had, as you know, because you've done your research, the ground was so poor as it was here in San Francisco. We have the same alluvial type soils here. We have them in Tarzana and Encino. That's what makes the San Fernando Valley so dangerous in an earthquake. We can talk about that. San Francisco is even worse. It's all on reclaimed soil. We had a market, and it had burned. The earthquake happened, and within minutes, or at the same time, I should say, the market burned. And as you pointed out, earthquake is not covered unless you buy it, but fire is. Our client, I don't know, I wasn't there. Our client tells us that the building caught fire first and burned down and collapsed, and that it wasn't caused by earthquake damage. As goes to attorneys, as I remember, are walking into the courthouse for the first hearing, a reporter runs up and says, "Hey, I have a videotape from your neighbor showing the earthquake damage and the building catching fire." Well, that kind of stopped everything. Everyone runs over to their VCRs, and sure enough, the building partially collapsed. Then the fire happened, and that's when they withdrew the claim. Was anyone prosecuted? No, because I don't know that anybody understood which happened first. It's very difficult to do that. Arson's a very difficult thing to prosecute. Looking back at the Northridge earthquake, which I was very much involved in, where there was plenty of earthquake coverage now at this point, not that people were buying it, I really don't remember running into that many fires. And when we did have fires, they had happened pretty quick after the earthquake. That's when mainly fires happen. I remember the Northridge earthquake. Again, I keep referring back to that. I jumped in my car, drove out to Calabasas to look at my kids. There wasn't a wisp of smoke in the sky. 20 minutes later, as I turned around and was coming back, fires were burning everywhere. Now, were they intentionally set? Probably not, because what's the first thing to go underground are gas lines and fuel lines. And if people understood what runs under our city streets, it's not just water and sewer lines, but how does fuel get to Burbank Airport from the harbor? It goes underground. How do these toxic chemicals go? So I think the fires, I really don't think many people burn their place, but fire is covered and earthquake isn't.
Another thing that happened in Silmar, and we can address this now because I'm sure there isn't very much reason for it today, even probably in LA, and that's flood insurance. Because in Silmar, we had the Van Norman Dam, which cracked, but didn't collapse. They were fortunate enough to get the water out to a different level. But they
I think they had drained the water partially before the earthquake.
Yes,
because they had already seen damages occur.
And they had a voluntary evacuation. Then they had a mandatory evacuation of 70 to 80,000 people. Some of those people didn't leave their homes. We just talked to a reporter who covered it. He talked to people who did the same things, like, I'm not leaving my home, And but when it comes to flood insurance in a situation like that, what do we have?
Flood doesn't help. First of all, flood is a terrible program. People buy it. You buy it when you're in a floodplain. You buy it when you're in the hills where pipes can break and come down. The problem with National Flood, and that's the only program out there, is that your property can be damaged, but you can't make a claim unless two contiguous properties next to you suffer damages as well.
Hmm.
That's the National Flood Program. Terrible. I don't recommend anybody buying it. That's what happens when you have government mandated programs. You're going to get the worst program out there. Mm-hmm. So I don't think flood really became an issue. Earth movement, flood does not cover earth movement. You have to buy actually a different type policy called a DIC, or difference in condition. That would cover the landslide that would happen after an earthquake. So there are ways to insure it without having to buy a specific earthquake policy, but a DIC wouldn't help your house. So it is out there. But most of the programs, we have these California Earthquake Authority, then other companies started offering it, and the CEA policy is so overfunded now that deductibles are actually coming down. But that will change because we're due for another earthquake.
And what's the insurance industry done, or not done maybe, in regards to preparing for that 7.5 quake?
My guess is nothing. We know there's going to be firestorms. We know there will be a firestorm every year. We went through the Thomas Fire. We went through the Paradise Fire. And yet the insurance companies can't get employees. They can't find adjusters. They hire people from all over the country to come out here that have no clue what they're doing with. The answer is they're not prepared for it. There are reserves that insurance companies put away. There are probably government mandates. I'm not on the insurance company side, so I don't know. But I can tell you what they think in a claim in a minute. So there are contingency fees, but we're going through that right now with the pandemic. There's very little virus coverage out there. And what policies do cover it, they are being so restrictive on it that virtually no one's at this point going to collect anything. Again, insurance companies look at the risks. If they see it's going to hurt them, they write it out of the policy. That's what they do. They're not, and every time another example is mold. 2 big cases came down 10 years ago, a Ballard case and the Ed McMahon, which were multi-million-dollar awards. And what do you get now? The insurance company knocked mold coverage out of their policy. The government made them put it back in. So now your homeowner's policy most likely only covers you for $5,000 for mold. And yet almost every fire is going to have mold involved in it. If water is put in a building, whether it's a flood or firefighting, you're going to get mold. So they just keep writing it out. So what are they doing to prepare for it? Trying to write out as much coverage as possible. Most companies don't cover earthquake. And if they do, they cover it through a separate company. My guess is you will have many companies on we haven't seen a big earthquake out here yet. Everyone thinks the Northridge earthquake was big. It wasn't. I think in your scenario, 7.5 or greater, I think you're going to see most of the carriers go under. There'll be a huge loss of life, but that's just what happens. More important is how are they going to respond to claims and what are they going to do? I can give you an example in the Northridge earthquake, because that one I was intimately involved in the claims process. I can tell you what one direct writer did if you want to hear that story. Take the Northridge earthquake. One of the insurance companies that you see advertised all the time on TV was going around basically telling their clients, every client, whether it was a homeowner's or a condominium building or an apartment building, your losses are just under the deductible. Or they would say your losses are $100 over your deductible. Remember, earthquake has high deductibles. These clients would tuck their tails between their legs and go, okay, and accept that. We're now soliciting business, and we would go behind them, and I'm looking at that same building, and where they may have had a $50,000 deductible, I'm seeing millions of dollars of damage. So I called a friend of mine who is pretty high up in the chain of one of these direct writers and said, what are you doing here? I'm coming behind you after your adjusters have been out and have told your clients, your insureds, that their losses don't exceed their deductible, and yet I'm seeing millions of dollars of damage here. And he laughed. He said, let me tell you how it works. We are telling everybody it's below their deductible, or we're 500 over, here's a check. And most of these people are going to accept it and walk away. And I said, yeah, but 10% are going to come, or 20% are going to come after you, reopen the claim and argue, and probably half of them will sue you. He said, so what? He said, look at the money we saved by not paying 80% or 90% of the claims. And that worked for them for 2 years till a law firm got together. We had been complaining to the Department of Insurance. We'd called our legislators telling them what we're seeing here. And finally, they passed a law a few years after the Northridge earthquake that said, if you had settled your claim or outside of the 2-year statute of limitation to sue them, or 1 year, depending upon who you're talking to in California. And they said, basically, if you signed a release and didn't use an attorney to settle your claim, you can reopen your claim. All of a sudden, we're flooded with new claims. We only dealt with condominiums and apartment houses. I didn't want to do individual businesses or homeowners. I think our average collection was about $750,000 more than what they over their deductible, and our biggest was $22 million. Wow. And they were told it was below their deductible. This is 9 buildings in Santa Clarita that literally jumped off their foundation. Now, after the Sylmar earthquake, we had new building codes come into effect, as they did after the Northridge earthquake. One of those codes was strapping down or tying down your foundation. This particular building, after we strip it out, and every one of these 20-unit buildings had jumped the foundation, we saw that they had poured the foundation with the tie-down bolts, straps in it. Next, the guy comes down, drops his sill plate. Another guy comes behind him, drops a washer and a nut. And then there was a third guy to put it on and tighten it down, but the drywaller got there first. So even though these buildings had the tie-down, they had the washer and the nut, they never put them on the tie-downs. And that's why the buildings jumped. And the insurance company paid about $22 million on this claim.
Was that the same, was Sylmar the reason, or Northridge, or maybe something else, the reason for the required to tie down the hot water heaters?
Same thing. All of this is, I'm aware of it, of the 86 code change, because 1986 was a huge code change. We went from the Uniform Building Code Act to the Universal Building Code Act. I may have that backwards, but 86 was a big, big change. And that came, of course, after the Northridge earthquake. And that mandated...
that'd be after Sylmar.
After Sylmar. Then they did it again after the Northridge earthquake, because in Northridge, we realized that drywall has no shear value. So now, when you build a house, a wood-framed house, even the first story has to be sheared. It used to only make you do that on a 2-story house. Now all stories have to be sheared. So every time we have an earthquake, we learn. We learned, again, I'm sorry, but I keep going back to Northridge.
Okay.
We learned about shear value. We learned about tie-downs. We, the Greenspan company, brought out an engineer, because we had a lot of these buildings that had 2 levels of parking with post-construction and slab, and then the condo built above it. Well, the insurance company, we're seeing cracks everywhere, and they're saying that, and here was the thing, they kept tying it back to the Whittier Narrows or the Sylmar earthquake, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. And they would say, oh, that's pre-existing damage. So we brought out, our engineering company brought out an x-ray machine. We actually x-rayed one of these posts and saw that even though there's no physical damage on the outside, it's all shattered on the inside. So where the carriers just wanted to patch and paint, we were taking buildings down and pulling out the whole parking structure.
One of the reasons the hospital collapsed,
The veterans.
Yeah. Was they had way too much open space on the bottom floor. Mm-hmm. It sounds like a lot of what we're talking about with the parking structure in Northridge, which collapsed over by Seaside. Mm-hmm. So
I was involved in that, actually.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, we had that building. It collapsed again. It was due to poor building, poor codes. But again, we learn every time there's an earthquake. That was a bad one. What was more interesting to me was actually a high-rise building off of Canoga in Woodland Hills, where the whole second floor collapsed. Oh, the whole front of the building fell off. So you could literally look into all the offices, see the desks and everything. Again, they weren't tying them down. That's where clipping came in. What you're referring to was the second floor actually crushed. And thank God the earthquake was early in the morning before people were in there. So there's, there's really nothing to tell. It was just not engineered right. It got paid. Same thing with the parking structure at CSUN. That collapsed as well. So they're rebuilding them. They're doing them differently today. But I want to talk about engineering for a minute. Most of what I'm going to talk about is negative to insurance companies. We had a real issue in the Northridge earthquake that ties back to Sylmar. So one of the big problems we had, which ties back to both the Sylmar and the Whittier Narrows earthquake, was the insurance companies would hire engineers who would say pretty uniformly, especially with two of the major carriers, again, I won't say their name, but you see their ads every day on TV, that all this damage was pre-existing back to the Whittier Narrows or the Loma or the Sylmar earthquake. So what typically happens in a claim is we get hired, we bring an engineer out, they're going to write a report to tell us what the physical damages are and what the fix is. Then we'll have a contractor bid it, turn that into the insurance company and make a collection. Insurance company will do the same thing. So they would go to a local engineer here in Southern California who would write a report. Then those reports were sent up to a company in Palo Alto. And they would then peer review these reports, and every single one came back down as they were wrong. It was really tied into the Whittier Narrows or the Sylmar earthquakes. Now I'm handling a claim against an insurance company in a condominium, and I have a door frame, a double door frame that's collapsed, so the door will not open. The tenant or the owner of that unit was a paraplegic. So the insurance company, we give them the claim. They bring the local guy out. He looks at it. They then take that report and send it through their attorney up to Palo Alto for the peer review. Well, unfortunately for the insurance company, the attorney they were using has the same name as I do, with two B's, Robb with two B's. They send me the report. Now I've got the original report in hand. It goes up to Palo Alto, it comes back down, rewritten, and it's all pre-existing damage. The original report said all damaged by the Northridge earthquake. Well, that's when the FBI got involved. And that's when I went on, did I go on? I think I went on 60 Minutes and talked about this. They threatened to sue me because I had said their name publicly. I said, fine, sue me. Let's go into court and let's talk about this and you prove I'm wrong. And I never got sued. They actually changed their name because they got sued by the government and had to change the name. And that engineering firm still exists today. It's under a different name. This is how insurance companies work. People always ask me, should I buy insurance? Well, that's an interesting question. If you feel the damages to your property are, and your property is old enough that it wasn't built to today's standards, which are pretty good, so we think, then maybe you should buy earthquake insurance. But as I said earlier in our interview, you've got to look at this as major catastrophe damage. Your house has to pretty much come down to really reach the deductible. We don't build with brick chimneys anymore. They would fall through the house. That wouldn't trigger it. My house was a total loss. I lived in Encino, and I was on cut and fill. So they cut into the hillside, take that dirt, fill it out, and make a pad. It dropped 2 feet. So I lost my house. When I ran out of my house after the earthquake, I could see stars down the whole house because the roof had separated by 2 feet. And but mine was a wood-framed 1940s house built in San Fernando Valley. Our soils are so bad in San Fernando Valley. If you were to interview Dr. Lucy Jones, she'll show you, and you can see it, a simulation of a 7.5 or an 8-point earthquake that happens in Riverside. And you see the waves coming, and they get moderate, and lower damage. Then it hits the San Fernando Valley and goes back to red again. And as she describes it, that alluvial soil that we're all dealing with, that's why the hospitals collapse, the dams collapse, is like a bowl of Jell-O that you whack with a hammer, and it just starts doing this. And that's what LA does. You get outside of LA, San Fernando Valley, all the way up to Ventura, you're not going to find damage. Then hit Ventura, we had earthquake damage up there. So it's really about the soils. So should somebody buy earthquake insurance? If you can afford it, and you feel that your property could be devastated by damage, yes, you should buy it. What I do recommend for businesses, if you have sprinkler systems, whether you buy earthquake or not, you definitely want to buy what we call EQSL, earthquake sprinkler leakage. You're much more likely to have a sprinkler pipe burst and flood your property out than you are recoverable damage under earthquake insurance. Most people, their house is their biggest investment.
Yeah.
But look at the cost of earthquake premiums.
So
the association buys.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Right, because they're responsible for the structure.
Okay.
You're responsible from the unfinished drywall in.
Okay.
Most condominiums.
Yeah.
You got to read the CC&Rs. So your damages could be 50, 100,000. You may lose your cabinetry and your flooring and your fixtures and all of that, but the building itself will be insured by the HOA or the homeowners association.